Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ahmed Atif. I'm the counselor or the advisor to the chairman of the STC office in the United States of America. And it pleases me and give me honor to present to you Dr. Stephen Day, our host today, who's going to talk about his experience as well as about his information, the information that he has gained throughout his career as a well-known academic researcher and an author of several books and articles on south of Yemen and on the region as well. And we are really honored to see him today here with us. And we want to thank you, sir. And I'm not going to take time, but if you have any questions after his presentations, you are most welcome. We will try to group the questions as they come, so you will get the chance to reflect on them. And we would like to really utilize our time to the maximum possible extent so that we will benefit from this presentation, which we are looking forward to. Thank you, Dr. Stephen, and thank you very much for coming and giving us this opportunity to present your experiences and also to talk about your experience with South Yemen and with the different books and articles that you did create throughout your career. Thank you, sir, and the podium is yours.
My pleasure, and I want to thank the STC for inviting me to the webinar today. I want to thank Abdulsalam Mosid and his staff at STC offices in the US to speak about my research concerning problems of national unity in Yemen going back to the 1990s, namely the problems deriving from multiple internal divisions in the country. I want to give the audience some further background on my academic research in 2 books while working as a professor of Middle East affairs at colleges and universities in the state of Florida. My recent 2020 book by Palgrave Macmillan, entitled Global, Regional, and Local Dynamics in the Yemen Crisis, looked at foreign and domestic issues related to the ongoing war. I authored the introduction of the book and chapters about the roles played in the Yemen crisis by the US government and the Southern Iraq movement, which eventually became the Southern Transitional Council. I started this book because my earlier 2012 book by Cambridge University Press, entitled Regionalism and Rebellion in Yemen, A Troubled National Union, focused exclusively on the domestic scene inside Yemen. Once the fighting started in Yemen in the fall of 2014, and then became an international war in late March 2015, I realized that it was necessary to add an analysis of foreign affairs in order to make some sense of what happened in the country after the old Saleh regime collapsed in 2011 and warfare erupted in 2014 and 2015. My earlier book, Regionalism and Rebellion in Yemen, was largely complete prior to the revolutionary events of 2011. And as the publisher prepared to release it, I was able to add a final chapter that took into account what happened in 2011 as the era of the Saleh regime ended. While the early years of the post-Saleh transition turned out much as I expected, especially the result of the National Dialogue Conference in 2013, 2014, calling for a 6-state federation, which was predicted in my 2012 book, the events of 2014 and 2015 were outside the range of my first book. Thus, I expanded the analysis of the second book to look at domestic and foreign causes of events. My co-editor in the UK, Noel Breheny, helped tremendously with production of the second book, Global, Regional, and Local Dynamics in the Yemen Crisis, released last year. Today, I will speak about the contents of research in both books, but knowing the reasons why Abdulsalam and his staff invited me to speak, I'll spend more time talking about the first book because I understand they want me to speak about the legitimacy of the STC, given the fact that most observers in the US who focus on political issues in Yemen tend to discount the STC. There are a number of reasons for this discounting of the STC's significance. Political observers tend to think that the STC is an artificial construction. Typically, it's said that leaders in Abu Dhabi created the STC. Yet this is untrue. Opponents of the STC, especially from northern areas of the country, love to make this accusation against the STC. But the STC clearly has local roots deriving from the popular Iraq movement of the middle 2000s, long before the end of the Saleh regime in 2011. Moreover, it goes back to Southern grievances in Yemen's 1994 civil war and the years that followed when the South was under military occupation of Saleh's armed forces. I'm glad to refer to the early research in my 2012 book that indicates why such false accusations against the STC are a mistake. The second important reason given for dismissing the STC as an organization is that it is assumed to run counter to, quote, a strong sense of Yemeni national unity in the country, end quote. Especially here in America, government analysts tend to read into Yemeni politics, I think, the politics of the US Civil War in the 19th century, when talking about regional north-south divisions in both America and Yemen. Yet this is absurd for a number of reasons. I actually recall from my years as a doctoral student at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., one of my dissertation committee members was a strong sympathizer with Yemeni unity and Arab unity. And he tried to justify the actions of former President Saleh in 1994 based on what Abraham Lincoln did in the US in the early 1860s. In my dissertation defense, I pointed out that the US Civil War occurred nearly 1 century after America's union as a democratic republic, in which power transferred peacefully dozens of times in free competitive elections prior to the Civil War. But this was not true in Yemen. Former President Saleh consolidated the union by military means just 1 year after the first disputed and inconclusive election in 1993, in which Saleh's ruling party, the General People's Congress, failed to win a majority of seats in the parliament. In other words, there was no mandate, electoral mandate, for what happened in Yemen's 1994 war. It was an illegitimate means of consolidating Yemeni national unity, and it remained controversial and a source of grievance and unrest in the South throughout the remainder of the 1990s and the following decade, before Saleh was removed from power in 2011. Thus, it's very important to understand that the foundations of Yemeni unity, based in Sana'a, where members of the Houthi family and their Zaidi revivalist supporters now claim to represent popular interests throughout the entire country, were weak as far back as the early 1990s, only a few short years after Yemen's national unification. I often find that people in the US who follow events in Yemen do not like to hear this point made, and I'm the main scholar working on Yemen in the US who has consistently made the point about the weakness of Yemeni unity in the early years of 1990, the early 90s, up through the civil war in 94. Yet it is a fact that Yemen's national union had an extraordinarily weak foundation. People like to sweep this fact under the proverbial rug, yet it cannot be ignored or denied. The other thing that tends to happen is that political observers explain Yemen's current politics as a two-sided problem. First, Yemen's so-called legitimate government associated with President Hadi, who resides in exile in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And second, the leaders of Ansar Allah in Sana'a, namely members of the Houthi family. Whenever there are discussions of how to resolve the problems of Yemen, the focus is typically on these two sides, legitimacy and Ansar Allah, excluding other actors like the STC. Thus, it is true that there needs to be justification given for the STC. Too often, one encounters dismissive attitudes toward the Southern cause in Yemen, but this is a mistake, as I said. What needs to happen is that international organizations like the UN and foreign governments that are involved in resolving Yemen's problems include STC leaders as important partners in all negotiations to end the fighting, to search for peace and find a path forward that works for the interests of local populations. For 3 decades, I've researched Yemeni politics as an academic, a professor, and a scholar. All along, there were people who dismissed the idea that there was any relevance to the Southern cause, or they dismissed the idea that Yemen was more complicated than the usual attempts to boil down its politics to simple two-sided understandings, like the description of the old North-South divide in the late Cold War years. As I said, my experience with this dismissive attitude goes back to the 1990s when I was a student at Georgetown, and members of my PhD committee rejected my dissertation research about multiple divisions in the country because presumably the work I did in the field was flawed. Yet events in Yemen after I received my PhD showed that my research was correct. By the time my first book was published in 2012, my thesis became the accepted view. After Saleh was removed from power in 2011, I had many people tell me that, quote, everyone knows Yemen has multiple divisions, end quote. But this was not the accepted view in the 1990s and the early 2000s. I had a lot of confidence in the research I did in the 1990s because I studied with the famous Palestinian-American scholar at Georgetown, Hannah Batatu, whose main works dealt with Iraq and Syria. He always encouraged multidisciplinary approaches that followed the evidence, not political ideology or political preferences and wishes of what politics should be in an ideal sense. Much of the research about Yemen at the time of its unity in 1990 was based on wishful thinking. Indeed, much of the Yemeni government's own policies after unity were based on wishful thinking. The first point I want to emphasize is that Yemen is and always has been far more divided than its old British Ottoman era north-south border would suggest. I learned this point from careful fact-based research on central local government relations in Yemen during the middle 1990s. It is all documented in my PhD dissertation, which formed the content of the first 6 chapters of my 2012 book, Regionalism and Rebellion in Yemen, the Troubled National Union. The second point to emphasize is how my research dealt with identity formation and how the latter is shaped by political cultural forces due to economic resource competition. There's extensive theory on this point in the field of political science, including the main work of Benedict Anderson in his 1983 book, Imagined Communities. He was a longtime professor at Cornell University in New York. My references to that research appears in the introduction and first chapter of my 2012 book. I think it's a point that Yemeni political leaders in all parts of the country need to pay attention to, because it's absolutely critical to the working of national identity issues inside the country. For the sake of my research on Yemen, the key point I took from Benedict Anderson's work and the work of others was how groups of political leaders born in the mountainous region around Sana'a, what I defined as the highland group of Yemen, exhibited domineering behavior toward people of outlying regions on the western coast, in the interior at Marib, in the south at Aden, in the east at Hadramaut, seeking to control valuable resources in the country. This was disastrous after national unity in 1990 because it inhibited the development of national unity sentiments among the wider population, causing regional identities like those that inspired Iraq in the south to emerge. Big problems in Yemen derived from the fact that politicians in Sana'a attempted to hold power in the capital rather than accepting the need for a devolution of real power outside the capital to allow entrepreneurship and encourage repatriation of exiles and investment capital from abroad that could benefit the country. Back in the 1990s and through the political transition of 2011 to 2014, Saleh and the Al-Ahmar family were the key representatives of the Highland group and the problem of central control in Sana'a, respectively associated with the Sanhan subtribe and the larger Hashid tribal confederation. The two families tore down the Republic of Yemen through their foolish rivalries in the 1990s and 2000s, as each attempted to place their sons in positions of influence to exercise continued control. The former southern ruling party of the Yemeni Socialist Party was the victim of scheming by Saleh and Al-Ahmar in the early unity years of the 1990s. It was not a surprise to me in 2014 and 2015 when Saleh allied with Houthi rebel leaders to seek revenge on the Al-Ahmar family, that Yemen's problems were magnified. Of course, the Houthi family and their Zaidi revival movement in the 1990s and 2000s, when they fought 6 rounds of war with the government, represent the older form of what I call Highland group domination, modeled after the old imamate that, of course, goes back more than a millennia at this point in Yemeni history. I had research sources in the 1990s and early 2000s who told me of the danger they saw if Saleh attempted to use the Houthi rebel movement against the Al-Ahmar family and the Islah Party, because it would hammer the nail into the coffin of Yemeni unity, causing the country to revert back to politics of the pre-1960s era when Zaidi imams ruled the country. This was before the 6 rounds of war in the 2000s that I heard this, kind of warning of what might happen in the country. When people with inside knowledge in Sana'a heard rumors that Saleh intended to use the Houthi rebels in this way, people who admired Saleh used to always say how crafty he was, describing him as the master of Yemen's divide and rule politics. But his partnership with Zaidi revivalists in the Houthi rebel movement was very foolish. At all times, it's important to bear in mind that Yemen is not as simple as two-sided politics. neither the Houthis, nor Saleh, nor the old Zaidi imamate represented everyone in the northern half of the country. People in Taiz, Tehama, Marib, and other places claimed not to be represented under each of these dominant highland groups who claimed to represent the people of Yemen. Highland leaders, whether religious like the Houthi family and the old imams, or tribal figures like Saleh and the Al-Ahmar family, certainly did not represent Southern interests across the pre-1990 border. They never did, and they never could. But the same was true in the north, and this is what I mean by there being multiple divisions within the country. If one looks at Yemeni history, there's simply no precedent for national unity under a single leadership. As a PhD student in the 1990s who was influenced by the work of Hana Batatu at Georgetown University, and Batatu was himself a trained historian, this piece of information about Yemeni history was the first evidence that I needed to know that the politics of national unity after 1990 was an illusion. Beyond the millennial-old history of Yemen, there's the fact of Yemen's topography, which I believe explains the lack of national unity across millennia. Yemen has no unifying topographic feature like the great rivers of other Middle Eastern states that are known for long periods of centralized rule, such as Egypt, Iraq, and Syria. Instead, its landscape is chopped up by massive mountains and valleys and vast canyons and deserts, which separate the population into unique social and cultural groups. There are two exceptions. First, the highland plain between Sa'ada in the north on the border with Saudi Arabia, through the capital Sana'a and southward to Damar and northern Ib, where Zaidi imams ruled. And second, the canyon system of Hadramaut. In these two large areas, there is the chance of reasonably strong political unity, yet each has sources of division as well. Generally speaking, what characterizes Yemen is division, not unity. Thus, any politician who seeks to unify the land faces a tremendous challenge. For many reasons, outsiders would like to see a strong centralized government in Yemen, but I think this is a fool's mission. It does not help Yemenis, and Yemen's population needs to adapt the way it thinks about the country to accept and tolerate differences between regional groups, allowing federal or confederal forms of government where populations in different regions are allowed self-government or autonomy. Houthi family members who serve as leaders of Ansar Allah are now, I believe, the greatest threat to better fortunes in the country because they feel empowered to pursue maximum territorial control, holding all power in Sana'a, as Saleh and the Al-Ahmars wanted to do in the past. Any Yemeni who's honest about their country would acknowledge that internal divisions are greater than any presumed sense of national unity. This has always been true, and I think one should distrust any claimant to political authority in Yemen, like Abdul Malik al-Houthi or President Hadi, who pretend to govern or rule in the interest of the entire population. There are multiple Yemens, and there needs to be a government structure in the country that matches this reality. I want to give a few examples from my research going back to the 1990s. To begin with, I could refer to those parts of my first book that talked about areas of the north that I visited when I was investigating relations between central and local government offices. And I found in areas like Taiz and Al-Hudaydah and Hajjah that people complained of excessive centralization in Sana'a. In other words, even on the northern side of the border, there were people who tended to favor discussions about federalism or some sort of confederalism within the country. Second, in Hadhramaut, I had a conversation once with the northern deputy governor in the Wadi area of Hadhramaut, who was from a traditional Zaidi ruling class family in Sana'a. And it was a very interesting conversation in the city of Sayoun. He talked as if he was protecting the interests of Hadhramaut when everyone I met outside his office spoke of the harm done by northern military occupation of the region. At the time, this was in the middle 1990s, the big issue was President Saleh's plan to divide Hadhramaut. He wanted to split it, the province, between the Wadi and the coastal region. But there was a popular groundswell of opposition to the plan, with many protests in the coastal and Wadi regions of Hadhramaut. This elder judge from Sana'a, he talked about his shared identity with Hadhramaut that simply never existed in Yemeni history. Moreover, when I asked him about the views of Hadramis outside his office, whom I spoke to, concerning northern military occupation of the Wadi and coastal Hadhramaut, and the interests of people in decentralization and local governor elections that would elect someone from the region itself, he spoke as if all such talk was part of some British conspiracy. This was a fascinating part of the discussion of the prior sort of British colonial era, back in the early part of the 20th century, a kind of conspiracy to keep Yemen divided. He referred back to the British federal plan for the South of 1958, which I knew was laughable, and sitting there in his office in 1996. When I was in the Wadi and I was talking to people locally that were all in favor of keeping Hadhramaut united, right, against the plans of people in Sana'a that try to divide Hadhramaut between the Wadi and the coast. You know, the real issue was that people in that region wanted to have, first of all, elections locally so that they could choose their own leaders, and they wanted to have government work in the interests of the local population. Everywhere that I went in Yemen, I heard similar sentiments, as I said, even in northern areas like Taiz and Al-Hudaydah. The third example I would give is in Aden, what I observed in the middle 1990s, after the 1994 Civil War, of popular complaints about the corruption of the Northern Armed occupation after 1994. I learned of three key benefits of the pre-1990 government, in other words, the former People's Democratic Republic of Yemen that had its capital in Aden. And first of all, people referred to the fact that early on, after the end of the British colonial era, the government passed a legislation to outlaw what was referred to as tribal revenge killings under old tribal customs. And obviously that was something that never happened in the north of Yemen. There continued to be very strong tribal customs, but people in the south, particularly in Aden, referred to the fact that after the 1994 Civil War, they felt that the government in Sana'a was bringing back that kind of politics of tribal revenge in the south that was a part of state law in the south. And so obviously people in Aden were in favor of having rule by law equal among citizens rather than having tribal customary law applied, as it is in many areas of northern Yemen. The second point that I heard people refer to was the benefit of what was called double auditing of financial matters in the former Southern government. After 1994, Northerners claimed that their victory, in a sense, in that war was really part of kind of the Cold War victory. They referred to it as sort of the triumph of capitalism over Soviet-style communism. And so they presented this idea northern control of Aden and the rest of the South as kind of a benefit for capital formation and business entrepreneurship. Yet the financial audit and treasury system, that double audit system in Aden that was eliminated after the 1994, was a relic of the British era. And I was told by an elder official in the financial ministry in Sana'a, who used to work in the old Southern government, that President Saleh eliminated that double auditing financial system that regulated transparency issues in government spending, that even the PDRY's former East German advisors, the communist advisors from East Berlin, recommended that Yemeni Socialist Party officials do not eliminate in the 1970s and the 1980s. Thus, in that way, this image of kind of what happened in 1994 as a continuation of the retreat of communism or the retreat of socialism was simply not true. In fact, there was an increase in corruption, and there would have been a lot of benefit if that double audit system of the South had actually been applied throughout the entire country. The third point I would emphasize is that the South always guaranteed more rights to women than the Northern regime had. And so after the 1994 war in particular, you heard complaints from many women living in Aden and other regions of the South that they felt that Northern military domination was taking away women's rights. But there were many other issues that people in the South complained of, such as the loss of certain social benefits in the fields of health, education, etc. To wrap up, and I would really like to hear questions and respond to what people have to say concerning events today and the current role of the STC. I want to make a few points. At the time of Aden's liberation from Houthi Saleh coup forces in the summer of 2015, in which Iraq resistance forces played a major role, aided by the UAE, I followed social media on the ground in Arabic, and I responded often to what people were tweeting, applauding the freedom that was gained in Aden after the Houthi and Saleh coup forces were forced out of Aden in the South, along with the photos and the videos that people posted of residents in Aden waving the old Southern flag. Afterward, many locals who began to follow my Twitter feed, they reached out to me and they started asking what I thought they should do. You know, they were asking me, should they seek immediate independence in the South? Should they hold a referendum on Southern independence? Should they send delegates to the United Nations? And I think to the dissatisfaction of those who reached out to me, I said that I did not want to advise them because I felt that it was something that they needed to do on their own, not based on my advice or the advice of a foreigner outside the country. I generally believe that it's not right for outsiders to impose their views on any issue, like the demands of independence in South Arabia. In addition, as a scholar and researcher who focuses on real evidence and facts on the ground, I see my role as an analytical one, to explain and describe what exists, not to prescribe or recommend what should be. And I still feel that way, but it's obviously been 6 years now since that moment in 2015 when the coup forces from Sana'a were forced out of Aden in the South. And I have a few thoughts about what has changed over the last 6 years. After the revolutionary events of 2011, I certainly thought that a Southern referendum should have been held in 2012, after the referendum on Hadi's presidency. I thought it didn't need to be a referendum that required immediate Southern independence. Instead, I thought it was important to find out what the public wanted, recognizing that the demand for disengagement, what supporters of Hirak referred to as al-irtibat, disengagement, could have been carried out over a few years. Likewise, it could be modified with federal structures, as the 2013-2014 National Dialogue Conference suggested, or going further to create loose confederal structures with more Southern autonomy than what the NDC permitted. Given the durability of Ansar Allah in Sana'a over the past 6 years, I think it's more necessary that a referendum on the Southern cause be organized, because I believe the Southern people have even less interest living under the authority of Houthi family members in Sana'a. And this needs to be recognized by the international community. As I said, I think the United Nations, foreign governments, they need to begin including leaders of the STC in discussions about what lies ahead in the future. I think that STC officials have the right approach. There needs to be a forum in the South to raise local issues and concerns. And STC leaders clearly have popular following across large areas of the South. It's not 100%, and STC support is weak in some provinces. Thus, the STC needs to move forward with caution and wisdom. The prior experience of Southern divisions in the 1970s and 1980s must be taken into consideration. I thought the calls for reconciliation and forgiveness, Tasalla wa Tasamma in 2006 and 2007 were the right approach. The STC should be flexible in its thinking of decentralized autonomous control in regions across the South. For instance, granting Al-Mahra and Hadramaut more autonomy while protecting the environment of Socotra Island and not permitting it to be exploited by foreign developers. But I think a central parliamentary body, including representatives from Hadramaut, Al-Mahra, and Socotra, needs to be based in Aden. This only makes sense that Aden be the capital of this southern entity. My recommendations for the future, I think it's very important to focus on economic productive forces, to think about creating administrative structures that create job opportunities, career opportunities for the population of the South, especially the youth of the South. And with that, I want to end my remarks. As I said, I look forward to taking questions. Looks like I went a little beyond 30 minutes there, Ahmed.
Well, you're fine. You're great. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Stephen, for this wonderful brief. And you really took your time the way we planned for. I think we will still have time for questions. And I see some hands being raised. So the idea here for questioning, I would allow you I will just ask you to put your question, and then you need to collect all the questions, maybe 5 at a time, if the Dr. Stephen would agree, and then he would reflect on those 5 questions. I think that's a reasonable number that you could reflect on, and then we will open the group for the other questions if existing. Thank you, Dr. Stephen, for your presentation, and saving the time, I'm going to ask Ms. Hadil Awis. She is from the Southern Press Agency in Washington, D.C. To ask the question because she raised her hand. Are you still there, Hadil? Okay, we lost Hadil. Okay, so it looks like we lost Hadil. Okay, so I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Jamil Muhammad. I see your hand raised. Go ahead, sir.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we do. Go ahead, sir.
A very interesting talk. It just appears that the problem is being framed in this sort of either unity or division, while I believe that's a misdiagnosis. I think the real problem within Yemen is corruption, oppression, poverty, stability. So it's sort of a false choice between having unity under the corrupt government of Ali Abdullah Saleh and or a choice of division there. Because even if in the south of Yemen, there's a lot of division, as you probably rightly mentioned about 1986 and the division between the two sort of camps there after and during the civil war and before the civil war there. So I believe that it's in the south we have this sort of nostalgic idea, this nostalgic myth of a unified South Yemen, where there were a lot of problems there. I mean, I believe every president was assassinated, maybe except one, or was overthrown within there. So, and even within South Yemen, if you ask the South Yemeni, are you Yafi'i, or are you Janubi, are you Sha'ibi, are you Janubi, are you Dali'i, are you Janubi, they'll always say that they're from the tribal area, rather than saying this south. So do you believe that unity is very, very difficult, especially when the players within Yemen as a whole, not just the Southern Transition Council, but even the Houthis and the rest, they're not independent. They're always dependent on regional players or world players for their survival and for their existence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Muhammad. I would like to also take two more questions, then we'll allow Mr. Stephen to reflect on them. One from Ms. Dabrowski, Karen, and then the next is from Alex. So Ms. Dabrowski, go ahead, please.
Yes, I speak to you from the Friends of South Yemen, and we've actually put forward a roadmap, a three-stage roadmap to see the end of the war and for the development of the country. And in our roadmap, we're proposing to begin with 2 autonomous regions, a northern autonomous region and a southern autonomous region. And we believe that this proposal has a chance of working because it actually doesn't involve negotiating with the Houthis who don't want to negotiate, and it gives them a chance to keep what they have for now, which they may actually accept, whereas they've never accepted any other proposals. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on this.
Me to respond, Ahmed, to these two questions?
Yes, please, go ahead. Okay. He's happy. All right. Event controller. Okay. Go ahead, Dr. Stephen. Yep. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Let me also say I see Hadil's but let me respond to the first two. I don't remember the full name, but I think it was Muhammad, the first questioner. I guess I didn't really hear a question. I heard him make a point, which I don't disagree with. I guess it was Camille. And I certainly understand that there are multiple divisions in the South and the North, and I made this point in my remarks. I'm well aware of the political problems of the South prior to. I heard you make reference to different, I guess, frameworks in which to discuss Yemen and what needs to happen. And you referred to the framing of the issues in terms of corruption, and that perhaps it's a false dichotomy to talk about unity or multiple regions. And I certainly don't disagree with the importance of addressing the issue of corruption, but I have to say that I often heard this comment made by people in the past who wanted to ignore the issue, that there are significant divisions within the unified political structure of the Republic of Yemen. And they preferred, to focus on these issues of corruption. But I have to say that if anything, over the last 10 years or 15 years, it's obviously become much more relevant to talk about issues of divisions in the country. The country is far less unified today than it was, prior to the start of the war in 2015, prior to what Yemen looked like before Saleh was overthrown in 2011. And like I said, I found during that time when I was in Yemen in the 1990s that the people who tended to ignore that issue of the regional divisions, I thought they were living in like a dream world. I really did. I traveled around the country and I heard people, my research was based on surveys, interviews, real information. And I would go back to Sana'a and talk to people, and they were in complete denial. They acted like, oh, unity's perfect. Everybody loves Saleh, and everybody's rallying around the flag. And I just thought they were living in a dream world. It was very difficult to communicate. There were a few. I have to say there were a few officials, including some sort of from the old ruling class in Sana'a, that were very troubled by what happened in the early 1990s and what remained after the 1994 Civil War. And they were advocates to Saleh, saying, look, you need to start reaching out, and putting Southern representatives in positions of governing authority, not just selecting Abdul Mansur Hadi as your vice president, but putting Southerners in positions of authority in Southern provinces. But they were the minority, and obviously what was mainly happening in the 1990s, as I said, was this kind of rivalry between the sons of Saleh and the sons of the Al-Ahmar family, and how, through their appointments, they were obviously holding the top military positions, and so they were all out there trying to gain as much benefit from the way the political and economic system was working. And as I said, that was destructive of unity in my mind. It further, according to the theory that I was operating on based on the work of Benedict Anderson and others, that's the reason why you end up with sub-national identities regenerating and becoming a question that undermines national unity. And obviously, that issue of what was happening in the 1990s relates directly to the question of corruption in the country. So I don't think you can separate the two. And as I said, I think the question of regionalism with the country is, if anything, far more relevant today than it was in the past. So I'm very familiar with your opinion, Jamil Muhammad. I've heard that perspective before. But I think that there needs to be instead far more attention paid to this question of administrative structures in the country. And to begin to respond to Karen Dombrowski's question, I certainly am not someone who takes a fixed position on the future. As I said, I tend not to prescribe, what should happen I'm aware that there are many possibilities moving forward. And certainly in my discussions with officials at the STC office in DC, I've always made this point that there needs to be flexibility in the way you think about federal or confederal structures. I hear what Karen's proposing as fitting in that category of talking about how you can still have some working relationship between North and South that is perhaps more confederal than federal. It wasn't clear to me, Karen, whether you were talking about northern, because you mentioned that the Houthis are not interested in that discussion. So I assume that you're excluding the part of the north that's under the control of Ansar Allah. So presumably your group is talking about some sort of federated or confederated relationship with government-controlled forces in Marib. They're very precarious, as you know, at this point, and perhaps other parts of the north. But I think that is the way forward. As I mentioned, I have been and I remain a strong supporter of the idea of holding popular referendums in the country. However things turn out, I think it's very important that it meet the public's interests. Certainly that it's not something that's imposed from the outside by foreign governments or by the UN Security Council. I do think some of the UN Security Council resolutions are going to have to change. There'll have to be a new set of resolutions, unless, obviously there's turn the course of the fighting in the war that is more in agreement with those UN Security Council resolutions back in 2014 and 2015. So if that begins to look more realistic, I don't think that's certainly back in 2013, 2014, I was one of the proponents of the NDC, six-region federal agreement. I had many people critiquing me at that time, saying that I was part of the problem in advocating a six-region federal state. And if you read my 2012 book, in that book I talked about Yemen essentially being 6 or 7 regions. And I have to say that obviously there were big opponents of the NDC outcome that contributed to the collapse of the government in 2014 and the start of the war. And obviously they justify what happened in terms of their opposition to the 6-region proposal, federal proposal. But I have to say, I think they made a big mistake. I think they would have been much better off if they had accepted to go along with what was the plan for the 6-state federation. I think it's much more difficult today to think about reconstructing any sense of Yemeni unity that encompasses all of the provinces, all of the areas of Yemen, than it was back in 2014. I hope that's a good response to both questioners.
Hello?
Thank you, Dr. Stephen. Now we have back Hadil. She raised her hand, actually. She was the first one. I don't know if she hear me. Hadil,
yes.
Please.
Hi. Yes.
Go ahead, please.
Hello. Thank you, Doctor, for all this interesting information about South Yemen and the region. That was really interesting. Do you think there is enough people who understands the divisions in Yemen like you and like us as journalists who focus on South Yemen? We see now Biden administration focusing on the Houthis, their conflict with Saudi Arabia, and there is not enough focus or interest in South Yemen, and not enough understanding that if we don't also deal with the divisions between South and North and the ambitions, the political ambitions of the people in South Yemen, there will be no stability in Yemen. Do you think the administration understands that and will take any steps to push for a referendum, maybe, or any new approach to South Yemen to make what they are asking to do, which is to stop the war?
Right. You can go ahead, Dr. Stephen. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay, Hadil, thank you for the question. I have to say that I think today it probably doesn't exist within the Biden. But I have to say that they're certainly much more aware of this issue. And obviously in the Biden administration, you find many of the same people that were in the previous Obama administration. Then, as I say, then it was true back in 2014, 2015, 2016. So they're aware of it. And I think they can be persuaded. I think they certainly need to be persuaded. I would encourage officials at the White House to reach out to STC officials in Washington and to meet with them and to prioritize this issue of giving a role for Southern leadership in the conflict and looking for ways to move forward. I'm certainly willing and interested to be part of those discussions, Hadil. So as you talk to people in the media, certainly refer to my research and my work and encourage people to get in touch with me.
Thank you, Dr. Stephen. So we have got two more questions here I see in the text box. The first one says, why do you think, this is from Masood, he says, what do you think are the steps or actions that we should take to make the American government believe in South Yemen and its right to gain its independence? And the second question is from Ali, STC, says that, do you think the Biden administration or Secretary Blinken will support the Southern issue?
As I said in response to Hadil, I do think that there are officials in the Biden administration who are willing to meet and to hear the case made by the STC and to take this into consideration. I've said before that I think the issue of a referendum is one of the ways to do this, to emphasize the need to hear from the population itself. And I would say to the STC, I think emphasizing this point, I heard the president of the STC, Zubeidi, interviewed on this point, and he encouraged officials in the Biden administration to become aware of the need for some sort of referendum in the South. I think that's the first step to take. And I would say that actually, to emphasize the point, you don't need the formal public referendum. I've referred to the possibility of hiring, private survey companies that work on public opinion, maybe to do some public opinion polling in different areas of the South to see what people, from Lahaj in the West to Al Mahra in the East, maybe include people on the island of Socotra to hear what their point of view is. But the more you can produce that kind of real information, that real data that shows that there is an interest among the population to regain some sort of autonomy, as I said, whether it's defined as autonomy within some sort of confederated structure or independence of the southern state. Perhaps those can be included in the survey questions so that you begin to get some sort of reliable indication of what is a public opinion. I think I answered both. They were somewhat related there on the question of what could be done. In addition to that, I would say the continued effort to request meetings with officials at the State Department and at the White House on this issue.
There is another question here from Adrian. It says, after the Yugoslavian and Libyan civil war, the viewpoint of the international community seems to be unity of countries at all costs. Do you think that, given the importance of international partners here, this might prevent a meaningful empowerment of the South? And then one follow-up from Ali. He said, a follow-up to your answer, the government of Yemen will never allow a formal vote for succession of the South from the people. That's what he wrote.
Okay, thank you, Adrian and Ali, for the questions. Let me take Ali's first because it relates to what I was just saying. As I mentioned, Ali, I don't think it has to be a formal public referendum. I agree with you that there will be obstacles put in the way of that happening. I think you can conduct private public opinion surveys that will begin to reveal some of that information. But I see what is the trend of developments in Yemen, and I'm convinced that at some point that's going to happen, that you'll have some sort of public referendum in the South about the future course. On Adrian's point about other examples of referring to Libya and Yugoslavia, the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, I've often made this point, and this is true, particularly here in the United States. U.S. officials look at international problems as being much more manageable if there are strong states rather than talking about the breakup of states. There's this very common view within the U.S. government that the failure or collapse of states is a cause of instability and insecurity. So I think that is a real barrier. However, I think the difference in the case of Yemen is that the side in Sana'a in the north that is making necessary this consideration of non-NDC, solutions to or steps, pathways forward beyond what was the result of the UN-led transition period from 2012 to 2014, is something that causes alarm in the United States and I think internationally. And thus there's a role for the STC to play in saying that we make better partners, right? We make more reliable allies than what you're more than likely going to find with a Houthi-led government in Sana'a. So I would say that's the big difference, right, between the examples you cite, Libya and Yugoslavia. The other point I would say is that, again, the reality on the ground is that very unstable unity that originated in 1990, and as I said, it was weak in the early 1990s. There were signs of instability, is not a political structure that has the prior life, and even Yugoslavia, the foundations of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia were older than the foundations of the Republic of Yemen since 1990. And obviously the same is true of Libya. So I think there are unique aspects of this issue in Yemen that certainly American officials need to be aware of. And I hope the speech that I gave or the talk I gave today helped to point out some of those issues that are different.
Yeah, so thank you, Doctor. And quick reference to what Adrian said about the Yugoslavian and Libyan examples. Me, myself, as a person who born in Aden, South Yemen, we never had a unified country prior to May 22nd, 1990. South Yemen and North Yemen existed since the beginning as separate states, and they had their own seats in the Arab League, in the United Nations, in all the international organizations, until 3 Beige Agreement suddenly happened between Ali Salam al-Bid, the president of the South Yemen at that time, actually taken back, the president of the Yemeni Socialist Party, who ruled the South Yemen at that time, and President Saleh, who visited Aden at that time. They agreed to have merged full union of both states. Before that, there were 2 independent states. So that makes it different from other examples like Libya. Libya has been existed as one unified country for since the beginning of the history. We could see Yemen case as an example of union that took place between states and being dismantled peacefully. Like, for example, Egypt and Syria, 2 independent states, they came together in late 50s, lasted for 3 years during Abdul Nasser time, didn't go through, peacefully being disengaged. So I don't see Yemen is different than that, because Yemenis are not really single monolithic people throughout history. As Dr. Stephen said, that there were multiple divisions and multiple backgrounds and religions as well, and tribalism and other stuff that would really make Yemen not a single united country. So that maybe that will shed some light on what Adrian has mentioned here about the Libyan and Yugoslavian state as an example. So it looks like there are no more questions. There is one more, I think, from Ali. He said that, what is your opinion of how much percentage of Southerns who want independence from the North? My own estimates, I believe it's had as high as 75% of Southerns. What's your opinion? So he's asking about your opinion, Dr. Stephen, on this.
Right. I have thought from the time of 2011, 2012, that it's a majority. You know, I felt if you'd held a referendum after the fall of the Saleh regime, that you would have seen a majority favoring independence. You know, if that was the choice, do you want to go back to having an independent South or remain part of Yemen? I'm sure that a 50% majority, more than 50%, would have chosen independence. Obviously, it's as we've discussed, you know, there are divisions within the South. It's not as though public opinion is the same in each area of the South, so it's going to vary from one region to another. I would say that the areas of the South that are close to the old North, like Lahaj and Dala and Abiyan, I would say that the public opinion is probably going to be higher there than the public opinion if you moved, you know, further to the east. Now, obviously, there are going to be areas in the east where you're going to find strong support for recreation of the southern state. And my sense is along the coast of Hadramaut, it's probably a very high percentage that favor recreation of the southern state. And as I mentioned in my talk, I think events since 2015 have only increased the likelihood and increased public sentiment in the South in favor of independence, because people in the South certainly don't want to live under a Houthi-led government in Sana'a, you know, under the authority of Ansar Allah. So if you put that on the public referendum, you know, as a choice, do you accept Abdul Malik al-Houthi, you know, as a leader of a united Yemen, or would you prefer recreation of an independent South? I bet you would see, with that binary choice, I bet you it would be probably 90% or higher that would favor independence.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Stephen. We actually had over an hour of a discussion so far. The planned time was 1 hour. We would like to respect the time of Dr. Stephen and everybody here attending this symposium or this webinar. We are planning to do more of these kind of webinars in the future, hopefully. And we would like to thank you for attending. And I would like also to thank Dr. Stephen for coming and presenting to us today. I'll leave the floor to Dr. Stephen if you want to say any closing remark.
Very much, Ahmed. And I want to thank Abdulsalam and staff of the STC offices in America for inviting me. It was really my pleasure. I want to thank everyone who asked questions. I wish there was more time. Certainly reach out to me. I have a presence in social media, and I'm always willing to interact with people that have questions about my research. Thank you again.